Hello Year 6, so here we are now. Let's carry on with our book Floodland, and we are on page 24, chapter 2. Eels Island, Zoe said to herself. I still haven't got a clue where I am. There were so many questions she wanted answers to. She still had no idea how this ragged bunch of people survived. The island was little more than a tiny strip of mud in the middle of the sea. All she knew was that she'd finally left Norwich forever. It'd been her home for all of her short, strange life. The houses her parents had grown up in were both underwater now. The house she'd been born in was a ruin. When it got too dangerous, they'd move further into Norwich, to higher ground. Zoe was about 7 at the time. It meant moving closer to other people. Zoe's parents didn't really like this. Other people generally meant trouble. As a result, Zoe had had few friends. There had been one or two, but gradually their parents had given up and taken the supply ship to the mainland. Every parting had been hard for Zoe. After a while, she made sure she never let herself like anyone too much, because sooner or later they'd leave too. When they came to move house, there were so few people left that there was plenty of space and plenty of huge old houses to choose from. Which one do you like, Zoe? Her dad asked her. She was standing at the end of a long street of large, detached Victorian houses. All of them were unoccupied and they'd all been looted too. What they needed was a roof over their heads and a large garden to grow food. Zoe looked carefully. Finally, she saw a house that seemed a little more friendly than the others. That one, she said, and walked up to the gates. Seems okay to me, said her dad. Beats raising a mortgage, doesn't it, said her mum. After the night when her parents had sailed away without her, Zoe hadn't wanted to go back to the old house. It was too much. She'd spent a long time moving from place to place, but nowhere seemed right, so she'd always moved. One day at the allotments, Natasha suggested that they live together. It wasn't long after Zoe had lost her parents and the allotments was still being organised fairly well. There was a group of men and women who ran the allotments. They guarded it at night to stop people stealing the produce, and in the daytime they organised the work. For a few hours' work, you could earn yourself some vegetables or some tinned food from their own store if there was nothing fresh to be harvested. Zoe and her parents had made good use of the system while their own garden was not producing the goods. It worked fairly well for a few years, not like later when things really started to go to pieces. Then there had been fights and people raided the allotments food store rather than work. Natasha's parents were dead, but she lived with some other people in an old block of flats. Zoe thought about her offer, but turned it down. She didn't like the setup and didn't like the other people. After that night on the shore, when she'd been separated from her mum and dad, something had changed in Zoe. The fight, the desperation, the fear on people's faces. She'd seen that everyone was only out for themselves and she knew no one really treated her as a bit of an outcast. But that suited Zoe, more or less. Let them think she was a tough loner and they'd be more likely to leave her alone. There was some truth in it, but really she was just too scared to trust anyone. She didn't want to be with anyone else. She just wanted her parents. Then Zoe had found the boat. She'd been searching for food. Most places had been scavenged for all their tins of food already. Shops, warehouses and so on. So Zoe had been forced to try the most dangerous part of Norwich. Here there were some old warehouses that were in a really bad state. Bits of them were always collapsing, and there wasn't a bit of ground anywhere that wasn't covered with piles of rubble. It meant stumbling over heaps of fallen buildings, but at least Zoe was safe from one thing: other people. She knew no one else came here simply because of the dangerous buildings. She hadn't found any food and was beginning to think of giving up for that day. Then she'd spotted the side of a boat sticking up through the mud in the old warehouse. The warehouse was right by the sea's edge, which was just a few feet below it. Boat and mud must have been washed in together in one of the high points of the floods, and now the mud gripped the boat like glue. Despite the danger from the ruined buildings all around her, she decided to make a new home for herself in the warehouse. She knew her mum and dad would have been horrified at the risk she was taking, but Zoe was more scared of other people than she was of falling bricks and stones. Later, she would change her mind as the buildings started to groan horribly in the slightest wind. Then she would move her boat to the safety of the shed in the graveyard, but for now, the old warehouse would be her home. She moved house into a tiny room in the roof of the warehouse. It had been an office. Clearly, no one had been there for a long time. The room must have been abandoned when the floods came, and there was still paperwork and office furniture sitting just as they had then. There was even some tins of tomato soup in a small cupboard in the corner. Zoe took this as a good omen, a sign that it was the right place to live. She was very hungry, and there and then she took the small pack from her back. It contained her most precious possessions: 2 water bottles, some bits of clothes, her compass, a bottle of vitamin pills she'd found, a pocket torch without batteries, a small blanket and an old book in which she'd meant to keep a diary but hadn't. Finally, she found what she was looking for. She took a penknife and skewered the top of one of the tins of soup. 2 holes, one to drink from and one to let the air in, so the soup came out more easily, just like her dad had showed her. She swigged the cold soup. It tasted great. She couldn't finish it in one go, so she carefully poured the rest into one of her water bottles, which was empty. Water was the hardest thing to find, much harder than finding food. She used the bottles to collect whatever drinkable water she could find, though occasionally she had found some bottles of mineral water. She mostly drank rainwater. She had hidden a series of tins and pans in various places, on rooftops and behind collapsing buildings, anywhere that no one else went. She would collect the water after every rainfall and store it in her bottles. She felt safe in the office room and could keep an eye on the boat too. She spent days digging it out, working as quietly as she could, just in case anyone was around, but she saw no one. One night there was a terrible crash. Zoe's fragile room shuddered and the whole warehouse with it, as she realised that a nearby building was falling down. She clung to the floor and prayed that her room wasn't about to drop to the ground with it. The noise was awful and seemed to take forever to finish, but finally it did. She didn't sleep for the rest of that night, but lay awake listening to the sound of bricks occasionally slipping and then settling again. Next morning, she worked even harder on the boat. At the beginning, it was just something to do to stop her from going crazy. But as she uncovered more and more of the boat, she saw that it was in good condition, and she began to have real hopes of making it float again. Finally, one day, it was free, and she began to wash the slimy mud from it.